I attended graduate school at the University of Chicago, actually in one of the most prestigious anthropology PhD programs in the world. And I'm not boasting, this will make sense when I get to the rest of it. This was during an era when traditional field work, which was mostly Western anthropologists fanning out to rural communities, was still the model. And while I was at Chicago, I don't know, in the US, PhD programs work differently. There was a lot of teaching, classroom learning involved. So when I was at Chicago, the requirements for the PhD included three full years of coursework. And we were on a term system, so I had 9 modules a year, and I had 27 altogether. I didn't really, but that's the way it's supposed to look. So during those 3 years, never once did I learn anything about methods. No one ever discussed them. We didn't ask about them. And each graduate student would come back from the field a completely changed person, but utterly unable to teach younger classmates anything about what actually happened out there, as if they had been to the moon and back. And the only story I actually really remember was that one member of a cohort close to mine hated her Amazonian field experience. In fact, she had to leave because the only privacy she had was a hammock, and there were always people around, and she just couldn't, mentally she couldn't take it, so she had to leave. But as was par for the University of Chicago Department of Anthropology, where we were all, of course, exceptional and special, the mystery of fieldwork became this thing, one of those things that made us exceptional and special. So we were all basically thrown in the deep end on our own, head first, and we were expected to swim to the surface and survive. And so some, actually really very few of us did, but that was part of our training. Actually, was not to teach us anything about methods. I started my own ethnographic fieldwork, and actually my ethnography was my second. Was kind of a post-PhD project, but I actually started it before I had my PhD. And I did that because I realized that I was never going to get a job in an anthropology department if I hadn't actually done ethnography. So I went and started this project before I finished my PhD, because that historical work was actually my PhD research. So I started this ethnographic project in a rural agricultural community on Mexico's southern Pacific coast. So I'm just going to kind of orient you here. Here's the US, here's Mexico. My work, my field site is down here in the state of Guerrero, which is infamous for reasons that maybe we can talk about later. Right down here by this municipal seat called Coaquinicuilapa, in this small community called San Nicolas. It's right there. Community members in actually this whole area of Mexico down by the coast are African descended Mexicans whose ancestors were, on the one hand, black slaves and servants who were brought to the coast by conquistadors, mostly to aid in cattle ranching. At the end of the 16th century this began. And on the other hand, indigenous Mixtecs, Muscos, Triques, and Nahuas. So today people in San Nicolas self-identify not so much as black as mixed black Indian, or what they call moreno, which is a term they use. And this actually was the main focus of my work, and it's the main focus of my second book, hence the chocolate cornflower, which is the way they talk about it, partly. So I began this fieldwork, and the decade that followed was very busy, and it included the birth of my son, which actually happened 10 days after my PhD thesis defense, and a year after I started this initial fieldwork. So you can imagine I had very busy a couple of years there. So nowadays, I tell students quite forthrightly that there are no manuals, or actually no decent ones, and to be honest, I haven't checked lately, for doing participant observation, very traditional kind of ethnographic fieldwork, as much as they would all like to become experts in ethnographic methods. And this is especially challenging to students in a department like mine, where methods are fetishized, but that might be the case all over campus. I have no idea. I'm kind of over there on Avenue campus among the humanities people, and I only really know what happens in my classroom. Methods, methods, methods. Stop it. So, they can't believe that I never had a module in how to do it. Well, why not? Well, I say some things cannot be taught, and among those things that cannot be taught is participant observation, which is the hallmark of cultural anthropology. Participant observation describes the extended immersion of the ethnographer in a social site where she engages with the rhythm of its people in order to collect what we traditionally refer to as thick and complex data that leads to a very deep understanding of a place. Kind of a definition. So I tell students that participant observation is a sort of in-between state, right? One is always on while doing it, and for months on end, always part of and detached from a community, both a participant and an observer, always being challenged through interaction with other people. And that's about as far as I can go generically, because in great part, every community and every ethnographer is different. So I say things like, well, what if we all watched the same film? Would we all see the same thing and understand it in the same way? No, they say, and we get into a whole discussion about why that would be. And then I say, well, what if there was no film per se? Instead, we each watched different frames of a film. Would we have seen the same thing? Well, that's more obvious now. What if we all worked in the same community, but in different parts of it and at different times of the year and for different periods of time? What if one of you works there 1 year and another of you 2 years later? Would you reach exactly the same conclusions? So in this way, I kind of get them to understand that no two experiences of watching or note-taking or participating or observing would be exactly the same. That's why there are no systematic procedures per se, and why, it's also why our understandings of other people can always only be imperfect. Now, of course, there are things one has to do in order to conduct participant observation. One has to gain admittance to a field site. One has to take notes. One has to improve one's memory. I tell them stories about that. One has to constantly be interrogating one's subject position and subjectivity and issues of power. One has to cross what we call the threshold of acceptance when people see you as a viable member of the community. But none of that is exactly the same as doing participant observation in order to collect research data. And in fact, even the steps I just outlined above hold an element of mystery, because in no given situation can the budding ethnographer predict exactly how any of these will work. A threshold of acceptance in one place might be quite different than it is in another place. So participant observation cannot be systematized, and its results are not testable or replicable. Each situation is unique. There's no list of procedures, no words to say, nor ways to interact, no rules to follow, or any structured method for doing it, and therefore for doing ethnography. There is no crutch. And each situation fundamentally relies also on the character of the ethnographer. Not everyone is cut out to be one, I sometimes say. It takes a willingness to create an extended dialogue between oneself and the living, breathing, thinking, emotional human beings with whom one works. It can be mentally and physically exhausting. You can't be shy. And even in the field, no one experience or conversation ever completely prepares one for what comes next. One has to improvise. Therefore, for example, the conversation I had with the elderly man on the plaza about why X ritual was done in Y way does not prepare me for watching my neighbor cook an iguana by burning it to death on a wood fire. You can't prepare yourself. So where I work, I often refer to participant observation with a laugh, but in all seriousness, as hanging out, gossiping, and drinking beer, all of which I happen to do quite well. So it's a perfect place for me, actually. Okay, so on a more serious note, at least at the University of Chicago, again, back to my training, the anthropologist Franz Boas was always lauded as the founding father of American anthropology. And when I'm trying to explain participant observation to students, I often start with him. Not only did he pioneer what in American anthropology we refer to as the four fields, which is cultural anthropology, linguistic, biological, and archaeology, Boas is also one of the earliest field researchers to make participant observation central to data collection. British students might be more familiar with Malinowski, who was another early field researcher. Boaz immersed himself in fieldwork so completely, and mostly in North America, that he often had himself photographed in traditional dress or engaging in traditional dance. So that's what he's doing here. He's actually doing a dance move here from a Kwakiutl ceremony. And here he's wearing an Inuit something, ceremonial thing. So Boaz's take on immersion was a bit eccentric, and it was actually also overly empirical in many ways, but it does illustrate an important point. Participant observation changes the ethnographer. It changes the way the ethnographer moves, the way the ethnographer dresses, what the ethnographer eats, how the ethnographer communicates, and the very questions the ethnographer asks. Over the decades following Boaz, ethnographers came to discover meaning, that what we see with our own eyes empirically not only is not enough, it is not always what we think it is. So the next most significant figure, I guess, in at least my training was Clifford Geertz, who came to argue that what we call culture is in fact turtles all the way down. Do you know that expression, turtles all the way down? Just kind of this infinite regress. You never get to the bottom of it. Okay, so the objective of participant observation becomes not masses of description, though that is the data, as my students reading ethnography for the first time this semester are learning, as they slog through all that data. But it's layers of meaning. Okay, so that's the significance is layers of meaning. It's not the data per se, but the meaning that is there. And this meaning is much more abstract. So how do we access an abstraction through participant observation? How do we convey something that doesn't really exist to something we can grasp, outline, identify, quantify, count, write about? How do we move from the act of participating and observing to writing down what it all means? So for the rest of this talk, I'm going to discuss how my particular field situation helped shape the dialogues that then shaped my fieldwork, and hence the writing that emerged from it. I'll describe my experience and the way that experience led me to an abstraction and to an imperfect understanding of what makes my village what and how it is. I'm going to begin with my personal position as an ethnographer and end with some comments on how different themes are connected. And to be more specific, I'll discuss children and childhood and the village's patronymic and patron saint, so Saint Nicolas. Okay, so I was who I was in the field for some obvious reasons, right? Because I'm female, because I'm American, because I'm white-ish, because of my age, because of my quirks, because of my interests, because of how I dress, because of the often ignorant, especially at first, questions I asked. All of these things were meaningful to both my participation and to my observations. But I inadvertently, and none of this was conscious, was whom I was in the field really because I was the mother of a young son. Even though, and I stress this point, who I was as an individual did not obviously change, not to my Western eyes anyway, right? I thought I was the same person with or without my child, but I wasn't. So my son was 3 when we first went to Saint Nicolas as a family. He attended kindergarten there. I'll get to this part. He attended kindergarten there. He learned to throw rocks with precision. He was beaten up and tripped because he had no older siblings or cousins to protect him. He got terrible intestinal infections. He screamed every night during his cold bucket baths. He's happy because he's done. There, the bath is done. I once had to hold him down wrapped tightly in a sheet so the clinic doctor could yank out a spine that was lodged in his foot. He sprained an ankle. He would eat only sugar-frosted flakes for weeks on end. I once caused him to vomit up grape juice all over the place, actually all over me, because I had inadvertently let it ferment in the heat. He hoarded his toys. His first words in Spanish were "es mío," it's mine. He made forts out of cardboard boxes. He screamed bloody murder whenever he was outside and firecrackers went off. Always, always in rural Mexico are firecrackers going off. So always, he was screaming and running inside. Yet he would sleep through the booming music that kept adults awake during these village-wide parties that went on until 4 a.m. in the morning or until the electricity went out. And when we returned to the States after months and months away, we had to untrain him so he would not urinate just anywhere or kick every dog that he saw. He was a lot of work. He was a big distraction. He was very tiring. Sometimes, I confess, I wished he wasn't there. And indeed, his father mostly looked after him because I had to be out and about. So to be honest, completely honest, it wasn't until I was writing that I noticed what my son's presence really meant for my ethnography. So when I first started working in this community, I was by myself. That was before he was born, and I would often find myself kind of sitting in this main plaza, which actually looks a lot better now, but it was only the past year or two that it's been fixed. So I would often find myself sitting somewhere around this main plaza, very self-consciously wondering what to do next, furiously scribbling notes about nothing, trying to look busy. I had a cot in somebody's storage room, but I had to find food in a place where there were no restaurants, and I had no idea how to cook on a griddle or light the firewood to heat it. And I had to find toilets in a place where everybody would leave themselves in the bushes, down in a gully with the pigs, or in their own private outhouse. So it wasn't easy, and nobody knew what to do with me. No one helped me, no one tried to get to know me. I am exaggerating a bit, but it was hard. Now, being with my family several years later was a completely different experience. There's another slide of, that's him about just the, yeah, that's, okay. So partly having my family along, it gave me something to do. It gave me a place to be when nothing else was happening. But mostly it was that having a child helped people to understand me according to what was important to them. And in return, it helped me to understand them. A single female, adult female, really has no place in Saint Nicolas unless she's handicapped. I mean, she can be there. People will talk to her, but nobody will know how to relate to her. Okay. A woman who is part of a family unit is understood, okay, by people. And to be honest, the father-husband doesn't really matter. Okay, it's the mother-child thing that matters. Nobody cares about the father-husband. Okay, so suddenly everybody knew my name. I was Laura, la mamá de Lucas. That's who I was, Laura, Luke's mom. Suddenly we had packs of children playing in our breezeway all day, every day. See if I can get to that slide. Suddenly I had a built-in reason to attend an event or to leave an event. One of the first such event I ever experienced was, in fact, and ironically, a wake for a 3-year-old child who was killed by a scorpion. This is just pictures of the funeral procession here. Apart from the emotional impact, one thing I remember, and of course all of this is in my field notes, so I never published much about it, is the moment in a child's wake when young girls dance with bougainvillea in their hands to 18th century French minuets called benoîtes here in this village. So the only time I saw it, and thankfully the death of a child is quite rare, the young girls danced in the dark front room with one bare bulb illuminating the dirt floor and the crepe paper streamers that were draped over the dead child who was laid out on the table and dressed in white. Why the dance? Why minuets? Why bougainvillea? Why white? Well, this was very early on in my fieldwork, and I didn't know, and I still do not know the answers to some of it. And no one could tell me because that's just the way it's always been done, and this is the ethnographer's constant companion. You ask a question, that's just the way it's always been done. So it took many questions, actually, and a stay over Christmas, when children also danced to minuets to honor the baby Jesus, that I came to understand these kind of connections between angels, innocence, virginity, children. But what I did realize at the moment of the wake was, one, that I would not have been invited had I not had a child myself, because being a mother had bonded me with 2 of my neighbors, both of whom were women of roughly my same age, and both who had children roughly the same age as mine. So there's Luke with our neighbor, Damien. Both of these neighbors who invited me to accompany them, because I never would have just walked in the room and attended the wake of a 3-year-old child. It was I didn't know the parents. So both of these neighbors who invited me to accompany them would become 2 of my closest friends, as well as my ritual kin, because of our children. I also suddenly realized that children mattered, and not just demographically, but symbolically. They meant something. So had I not had my son along, I wouldn't have been around packs of children. I wouldn't have grown close. Just showing some pictures of children around, children at play, children on a horse, children going to school. I wouldn't have been around packs of children. I wouldn't have grown close to the people that I grew close to. I wouldn't have paid attention to children's interactions with each other or to their interactions with the adults in their lives. I wouldn't have noticed subtle differences between male and female children. Okay, so here are some subtle differences, and here are some not so subtle differences. Don't tell him I showed you this. Okay, he's big now. So I wouldn't have realized how early in childhood gender roles become important. So I'll talk about this issue of like boys running around naked and girls always having to be clothed. I wouldn't have noticed this, I'm three-year-old children had I not had one of my own. So I wouldn't have noticed kind of these different gendered childhood roles. The boys who can't wait to shoot off the firecrackers and the girls who have to go sell baked goods after school and what all of that is about. I wouldn't have discovered that the illness that's known in this community as coraje, which I'm not going to talk about today, manifests differently in children than adults and why it manifests differently. I wouldn't have drawn connections between childhood and the patron saint of the village, and I wouldn't have understood how childhood, in fact, is kind of a metaphor for local people's primary social identities as a free people. An identifier that is always contrasted with being locked up, whether it's being contrasted with the way women are enclosed domestically, in which case it's kind of a gendered idea, or it's being contrasted with the way people were enslaved in the past. So I wouldn't go so far as to say that childhood was the key that unlocked the mysteries of this place and people, because of course I would have attended to many of these themes without my son in tow. It's more that children and childhood gave me an opening and became an unconscious framework that I could work with, a way of organizing this particular world. They helped me to make sense of things, to kind of fill in pieces of the puzzle. So I always tell students that what is most important, at least in the beginning, is not what you think, but that you think. It's not which framework you have, but that you have a framework. It's not how you see the world, but that you see the world, or a world. Okay, so this is the beginning of kind of thinking and thinking critically, right? The struggle might not end, but it becomes easier once you have these tools. A way to think, a framework. So childhood was a way for me to critically kind of enter this strange labyrinth that is someone else's meaningful world. So I think because there's a bit I was going to talk about the saint and his childhood, and he grew up in the village, and what that means and how that connects to these various issues about freedom and captivity and animals and crops and fertility, and all of these different themes kind of come together. And I'm not necessarily going to say around the theme of childhood, because that's not what I would argue, but that is part of this whole kind of complex of how people are, I guess, in the world, in this community. But I guess I don't have time to do that. So just the last little thing that I will say, I'll just show you the rest of the slides. There aren't that many left. So I was going to talk about, kind of children's growth and how they're free at first, but, parents discipline them and they go to work doing household chores, and they have to be cultivated. So they're likened to crops. So this is one of my goddaughters when she was about 12. And she has a life story, and she grows up, and her mother yells at her, and she has to do this and that, and she finally graduates primary school, and now she's a mother with her own 4 children, actually, in North Carolina. She's in the United States. So I'm going to stop here. I would have illustrated some of the ways in which my child, who was often a real pain in the neck, actually held the key that opened all of these symbolic doors. And he made me pay attention. And not just to him, of course, he was always making me pay attention to him, but to what went on around and because of him. Okay, so who one is perceived to be in the field, just as much as who one is, means that there are no rules for participant observation. But it's not a free-for-all either, right? It's instead this kind of delicate balance between what one hopes to learn and what people are willing to teach through their presence, their conversation, their subtle and not so subtle gestures, and their own understandings of who the ethnographer is. And I'm just going to close by mentioning that even though I had this child, I was often asked why I didn't have 2 children. Where is the other one? What about a girl? Well, you know, people would say, because people would say, if he, meaning my son, dies, you won't have anyone left. And when you get old, well, who's going to take care of you? A son won't do that. Only a daughter will. All right? So bringing your children up properly, right? And through these different life stages, kind of cultivating, domesticating, if you will, your children is very similar to domesticating crops, right? That are going to sustain you. And then your children in your old age, your children are going to sustain you if you've raised them properly, if you've done right by them. So anyway, because I only have a boy, I guess I will be on my own. So, okay, thank you.